Now we're going to look at a couple of the different crusades, at what the causes of each was and what the outcome of the battles were. Really, the spark that sets off the Crusades does not start in Europe, but it starts in the East, where the Byzantines first confront the Muslim force of the Seljuk Turks. And if you remember, this is the group that was originally hired as mercenaries by the Abbasid dynasty, but eventually took over the fractured dynasty. And in a lot of ways, they resembled the Huns or the Mongols, who had already come in and invaded the territory of the Muslims. And so it was a pretty legitimate fear when these Turkish forces started expanding into the eastern section of Asia Minor for the Byzantines. And the Byzantines met the Turks at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and they were pretty badly defeated. They stood on the verge of losing all of Asia Minor to the Turkish onslaught, and they ended up actually turning to their last resort, which was to ask Western Europe and the Holy Roman Empire for their help. Now remember that these two don't necessarily get along. There's been the fracturing of the Catholic Church over iconoclasm and several other issues, and there have also been issues since then as a result of speaking different languages and having different cultural beliefs. And so what ends up happening is that Emperor Alexius actually latches on to this story of the Christian pilgrims being murdered and also the Christian shrines being desecrated by Muslims in order to rise the level of fury of people in the western half of the empire so that they would come to the aid of the Byzantines. And while this story wasn't necessarily true early on, over time the Muslims did begin targeting Christians in greater number, and these Christians were going on their version of the sacred Hajj into Jerusalem in some cases and to worship at these shrines. And so what the Pope is attempting to do is to reunify the severed Eastern and Western churches, and also to reunify all of Europe into one by calling for a crusade in the form of Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II warmly embraced the idea of helping Europe's beleaguered allies and fellow Christians in the East, so he proposed a holy war, a radical shift in Christian doctrine to say the least, and explained this maneuver not as any substantive change of direction, but as an extension of a policy already in place entitled the Truce of God. And this program of measures was part of the Church's attempt to limit warfare within Europe in the day by insisting there be no fighting on holidays or weekends. So in Urban's crafty hands, this Truce of God was remolded into a declaration ending all wars in which Christians fought Christians and deflecting European militarism towards what was perceived as the real enemy, which are now the Muslim infidels in the East, meaning that the Byzantines can no longer fight with Western Europeans because they're Christians. So seen ideologically, the Crusades were this culmination of a peace movement, as illogical as that might sound, and needless to say, it took some monumental rereading of the New Testament, where at least on the surface, war is hardly the preferred vehicle of peace, but in those days, the Pope had the advantage of being one of the few in Europe who could read at all, much less reread, the New Testament. So in giving knights a holy vacation and calling them vassals of Christ, Urban II was granting anyone who joined his crusades an automatic indulgence, namely the forgiveness of their prior sins. So then, instead of paying penance for murder or killing, they could get salvation as long as they slew the right sort of person, which would be a Muslim. Not since Die for Rome had Europeans heard such a stirring advertisement, and when Urban began to sense how well this was going to work, he had his marketing campaign on the road. You can liken this to some of the political campaigns of today. In a spellbinding speech, the one that I read you a segment from, before a crowd of French knights, Urban exhorted his adherents to win back the land of milk and honey and avenge the Turkish atrocities allegedly perpetrated against their fellow Christians. He cited several of the gory details sent to him by Alexius Comnenus and ended by bidding them to fight for the remission of their sins with the assurance of imperishable glory. No matter his actual words, kill Muslims indiscriminately is basically what the crowd took away from this. And he said, God wills it. God wills it. So from the perspective of history, it's clear that there was a lot more than religious frenzy working in this First Crusade. The Crusades reflect other aspects of life in Europe at that time period in particular. The burgeoning population is probably one of the most significant features in the High Middle Ages. As destructive invasions began to come to a close, there was this relative calm that we discussed, and the continent quickly repopulated. It's difficult not to include then that the Crusades a century later are tied to the rapidly changing demographics within Europe, because the first three come almost exactly 40 years apart. In other words, they come at intervals of about a generation and a half, and if so, they are, in one respect, a means of bleeding off the ever-replenishing supply of young warriors, especially sons without inheritances or livelihoods, and in general, people seeking some purpose and direction in life. And there were political forces at work as well, since the Crusades were also tied to the investiture controversy, the struggle for power between the authority of Pope and the ruling political system in the Holy Roman Empire. From the papal perspective, the kings of Europe had long intruded upon the sacred right of the Pope to run his own business, that is, to choose the men who constituted the Church's administration. And in calling the First Crusade, Urban II shifted that theater of action in his political conflict to an arena where medieval knights had traditionally reigned supreme, which is the battlefield. In doing so, Urban usurped the prerogative most secular rulers had traditionally claimed. It wasn't typical for the Church to actually wage war. Worse yet, by reinterpreting that truce of God as a warrant for Europeans to kill Muslims and not to kill each other, he also sought to embrace secular leaders for all of their intra-European powers, which now looked positively un-Christian. Never mind that the Church had for centuries up until then sanctioned European upon European carnage, just not on certain days. Nevertheless, the Pope briefly owned the momentum and he set the spin. In other words, the Crusades gave them, even if it was just momentarily, the opportunity to redefine the rules of the game. But for all of the underlying causes, the major motivation driving the Crusades, both on the surface and well beneath it, was religious sentiment, something bordering on hysteria. There can be no doubt that a majority of Christian Europeans saw this call to arms as a means of salvation and a way of ridding the world of infidels. That, to them, referred not only to Muslims, but also to the Jews in Europe, whom we haven't really mentioned yet, but you'll see that the Jews become a part of the Crusades as well. Many of them are slaughtered on the way over to Jerusalem as the knights attempt to retake it. And these Christians slaughtered them because they also had a stake in the Holy Land. Ostensibly, they're going to say it's because their forefathers had murdered Jesus. If we look at the actual fighting of the First Crusade, it began in 1096 when Christian knights started to assemble from all over Europe and they moved towards Constantinople. The Byzantines were horrified to see the hordes of Western Europeans knocking at their doors, especially because most of the Crusaders were poor, and worse still, they were extremely poorly armed. When he had made his initial request, Alexius Comnenus had not asked the Pope for mobs of indigent desperadoes, but he had asked for a small force of skilled fighters who could help him repulse the Turks. And to the Byzantines, what they saw was really not any army suitable to help them. The lowest estimate of the Crusaders' force is around 25,000, and there were probably a lot more than this, perhaps as many as 100,000, and as far as the Byzantines were concerned, it was an uncivilized, ill-equipped throng driven by a sort of fanaticism as poorly cloaked in words of faith and brotherhood as their ragged outfits were. Moreover, the Crusaders' aims corresponded little with those of the Byzantines, who were seeking to stop the tide of Turkish aggression, and the Europeans, on the other hand, entertained these fantasies of liberating Jerusalem and the Holy Lands from Muslim oppression, and neither really understood or even listened to the other's words. They certainly weren't a unified force with unified causes for fighting the war, and as a result, the Byzantines acted in a fashion that was typical of Easterners, from the Western European perspective at least, and following a long-standing policy of baffling, stalling, and deceiving intrusive foreigners. Alexius actually greeted the Crusaders with cold but kind of reasonable hospitality, and as soon as it was feasible, he escorted them through his kingdom and beyond the eastern boundary of the Byzantine Empire, and vowed that military and financial support would follow. And once they were gone, the emperor promptly reneged on his deal and slammed the gate shut and prevented this ragtag group from returning. And surely he thought the Turks would make quick work of them, that they would just rush through them and annihilate them, and he would be free of this pest. But the Byzantines really underestimated the will of these crusaders from Western Europe, and by defaulting on his pledge of support, he earned Europe's distrust and that of the Pope as well. And Byzantium was now as much the Crusaders' foe as the Muslim state had been. So at length and against all odds, a lot of the Crusaders survived this betrayal. After all, as poor folk, most of them were used to getting by on just a little bit of food, and they didn't have a whole lot of comforts. So they drew onward because of their religious convictions, and they managed to get further than anyone ever guessed they would. They made it all the way to Syria, and somehow they engineered the capture of the capital city of Antioch in June of 1098. Though it proved a long and arduous siege, their victory gave new life to their cause, and continuing on south, they pushed their way into the Holy Lands, where they actually besieged and took Jerusalem the next year. And instrumental in that success was a brutality that was astonishing in its barbarity and ruthlessness. It was bloody enough to make a Viking proud. Of course, most of these were actually related to the Vikings genetically or culturally to the Normans, and treating the defeated as no better than animals, the Crusaders ravaged this entire population of Jerusalem. They captured Antioch, they exterminated all the Turks there, and later, after the sack of Jerusalem, they boasted of their own savagery and claimed, "We rode in the blood of the infidels up to the knees of our horses." And if this is true, it's pretty horrific. If it's invented history, it's almost worse. Whatever the case, the Crusaders' disregard of basic human decency has struck few over time as anything but utterly repugnant. And worse yet, there were few crusaders who had any long-term interest in settling the Holy Lands. They didn't want to live in Jerusalem. With Jerusalem now seemingly secured in Christian hands, most of its Western assailants wanted to go and return back home, where they were hailed as heroes. Some stayed and set up a Christian-run government. Then this forms into these four so-called Crusader states along the eastern coasts of the Mediterranean Sea. And here they actually build these European-style castles. They're called crux. And it's somewhat disconcerting to look across Syria today, and you'll see these crumbling medieval castles of a sort that you would expect to find in England or in France, that are vestiges of these Crusader states. So along with the other devastations they wrought, like the hatred they inspired between the East and the West, the Crusades also brought this huge disharmony to the cultural landscape of the area, arguably one of the most enduring legacies of their outrage. So given the bloody nature of the siege of Jerusalem and the legacy of this capture by the Christian Crusaders, I just wanted to read you a small section of a primary source account of this capture of Jerusalem. And it starts out, Moreover, the city is laid out most beautifully, and cannot be criticized for too great length or as being disproportionately narrow. On the west is the Tower of David, which is flanked on both sides by the broad wall of the city. The lower half of the wall is solid masonry, of square stones and mortar, sealed with molten lead. So strong is this wall that 15 or 20 men should be well supplied with provisions, they would never be taken by any army. When the Franks saw how difficult it would be to take the city, the leaders ordered scalding ladders to be made, hoping that by a brave assault it might be possible to surmount the walls by means of ladders, and thus attack the city, God helping. So the ladders were made, and on the day following the 7th, in the early morning, the leaders ordered the attack, and with the trumpets sounding, a splendid assault was made on the city from all sides. The attack lasted until the 6th hour, but it was discovered that the city could not be entered by the use of ladders, which were few in number, and sadly we ceased the attack. Then a council was held, and it was ordered that siege machines should be constructed by the artisans, so that by moving them close to the wall we might accomplish our purpose with the aid of God. This was done. When the tower had been put together, and had been covered with hides, it was moved nearer to the wall. Then knights, few in number, but brave, at the sound of the trumpet, took their place in the tower, and began to shoot stones and arrows. The Saracens defended themselves vigorously, and with slings very skillfully hurled back burning firebrands which had been dipped in oil and fresh fat. Many on both sides, fighting in this manner, often found themselves in the presence of death. On the following day the work again began at the sound of the trumpet, and to such purpose that the rams, by continual pounding, made a hole through one part of the wall. The Saracens suspended 2 beams before the opening, supporting them by ropes, so that by piling stones behind them they would make an obstacle to the rams. However, what they did for their own protection became, through the providence of God, the cause of their own destruction. For when the tower was moved nearer the wall, the ropes that supported the beams were cut. From these same beams the Franks constructed a bridge, which they cleverly extended from the tower to the wall. About this time one of the towers in the stone wall began to burn, for the men who worked our machines had been hurling firebrands upon it until the wooden beams within it caught fire. The flames and smoke soon became so bad that none of the defenders of this part of the wall were able to remain near this place. At the noon hour on Friday, with trumpets sounding amid great commotion and shouting, God help us, the Franks entered the city. When the pagans saw one standard planted on the wall, they were completely demoralized, and all their former boldness vanished, and they turned to flee through the narrow streets of the city. Those who were already in rapid flight began to flee more rapidly. Count Raymond and his men, who were attacking the wall on the other side, did not yet know of this until they saw the Saracens leap from the wall in front of them. Forthwith they joyfully rushed into the city to pursue and kill the nefarious enemies, as their comrades were already doing. Some Saracens, Arabs, and Ethiopians took revenge in the Tower of David. Others fled to the temples of the Lord and of Solomon. A great fight took place in the court and porch of the temples, where they were unable to escape from our gladiators. Many fled to the roof of the temple of Solomon, and were shot with arrows, so that they fell to the ground dead. In this temple almost 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared. It's also really important to not forget that there was a Jewish element within the Crusades, and this starts with the very first Crusade, and with not necessarily the birth of anti-Semitism, but certainly a furthering of anti-Semitic thought. And the next primary source I want to read to you is actually from the Jewish chronicler Solomon Bar Samson from the year 1096. And he writes, "At this time, arrogant people, a people of strange speech, a nation bitter and impetuous, Frenchmen and Germans set out for the Holy City, which had been desecrated by barbaric nations, there to seek their house of idolatry and banish the Ishmaelites or the Muslims and other denizens of the land. Their ranks swelled until the number of men, women, and children exceeded a locust horde covering the earth. Now it came to pass that as they passed through the towns where Jews dwelled, they said to one another, "Look now, we are going a long way to seek out the profane shrine and to avenge ourselves on the Ishmaelites. When here in our midst are the Jews, they whose forefathers murdered and crucified him for no reason. Let us first avenge ourselves on them and exterminate them from among the nations, so that the name of Israel will no longer be remembered, or let them adopt our faith and acknowledge the offspring of promiscuity." So within this chronicler says that the Christians came in and said that either the Jews needed to convert to Christianity or they were going to be killed. And they claim the reason for the killing is because the Jews' forefathers had killed Jesus themselves. However, it's also likely that one of the reasons for this killing is because the Jews also held a claim to the Holy Land of Jerusalem, and that if they went ahead and wiped out these people, they wouldn't have to worry about fighting the Jews after they finished fighting the Muslims, who they call the Ishmaelites in this passage. The Second Crusade is the heir, so to speak, of the first. Not only did it follow a generation or so after the first, it was actually a number of its soldiers were the actual descendants of those who had gone on the First Crusade. But the later crusade was also precipitated by the earlier one. So in more ways than one, the First Crusade really sires the Second Crusade. In the decades following the First Crusade, the Christian overlords of these crusader states failed to really integrate themselves into Middle Eastern society in any kind of meaningful way. They despised the native population, and that population despised them for their imperious and condescending nature, and many turned out to be cruel and abusive and despotic in their reign. Though there was a minority that proved kinder and gentler, the general impression of their rule was pretty far from favorable, and even their fellow Christians didn't like them very much, as witnessed by one of the churchmen who wrote home complaining they devoted themselves to all kinds of debauchery and allowed their womenfolk to spend whole nights at wild parties. They mixed with trashy people and drank the most delicious wines. And this situation really couldn't endure for long. It was in 1144 that one of the Crusader states first fell back into Muslim hands, and it reignited this crusading fever in Europe and led to the call for a follow-up crusade to resecure the Holy Land in the name of Christ. And it was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux who was perceived by many as the holiest man of his day, who endorsed the notion of a new crusade, and his sanction drew in many of the leading figures, such as the kings of Europe. He had the sense to really protect the homeland first, and he forbade the massacre of Jews, this sad overture that had opened up the earlier crusade. But in the end, the Second Crusade proved a pretty dismal failure. This time the Byzantines and the Turks were ready for the Franks, as they called them, and that is the Western barbarians, and they plotted together to exterminate them. So the Byzantines were actually helping the Muslim forces, and so betrayed on both sides by Byzantium and Turkish forces, the Second Crusades was what nearly obliterated the Crusaders as they tried to pass through Asia Minor. And what little of the expedition made it to the Holy Lands only ended up fighting with the survivors and the descendants of the First Crusades, who saw these new Europeans coming into their lands as a band of thugs who were there to rob them of their lands. It was pretty much all chaos breaking loose. You've got Byzantine Christians fighting with Muslims against Western Europeans, and then you've got the ancestors of the first wave of Crusaders fighting against this new wave of Crusaders, hoping to keep their land and their wealth. And the result was that most participants of the Second Crusade went back to Europe empty-handed. And it was such a pitiful group that St. Bernard was forced to admit, "I must call him blessed who is not tainted by this." That killed most Europeans' interest in crusading for about a generation or so, until we lead into the Third Crusade. Just like the Second Crusades, the Third Crusades were also precipitated by a turnover of power in the Middle East. Especially in this case in Europe, there was a new Muslim leader who arose named Saladin. And if you remember, I actually read one of his speeches earlier on. He goes in and he recaptures Syria and he takes most of the Holy Lands, including Jerusalem, in 1187. And his assault is so forceful that the Crusader states are reduced to little more than this port of Tyre and a few remaining castles. And with Jerusalem no longer in their hands, Christians say that some kind of reprisal is called for, and of course this is going to be another crusade. But this time they're going to have one that's well organized and well equipped, and they figure there's no one better to do this than the foremost regents of Europe. And so the kings of Germany, France, and England all come together. So the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the French King Philip Augustus, and Richard the Lion-Hearted, the King of England, actually put aside their political differences, and you see once again this diverging of various interests within the Holy Roman Empire coming together in order to fight a common enemy. And that enemy, of course, is an affront to Christendom at large. And this very large, well-funded, planned-out trip had absolutely no chance of success, probably because of the fact that it was headed by 3 different people. So first, along the way to Jerusalem, Frederick Barbarossa actually drowns while crossing a river, and he either drowns because he had a heart attack or because he fell off his horse and his armor was so heavy he couldn't swim back up to the surface. And his troops, who didn't have a leader, then turned back and went back home. Then you had Philip and Richard having a huge quarrel, and according to the gossip of the court, the personal issue they were trying to work out was that Richard was gay, and that he had made advances towards Philip, and that this complicated relationship actually caused Philip to not want to help with the siege of Jerusalem, and he goes back to France. So he leaves Richard all alone with his forces, not enough of an army to retake Jerusalem, but they continue on anyway. And when they reach the Middle East, Richard goes and he meets with Saladin, and they, after a bit of jousting and some general medieval male bonding, if you can trust the accounts of that day, they manage to forge an agreement to let Christians visit the Holy Lands without being hassled. But making deals with Muslims was not really viewed favorably as the point of crusading. So Richard's stock really drops precipitously with his people, and when he's on his way home, he gets captured. But he's not captured by Muslim forces. He's captured by Germans. Actually, he's captured by the son of his former ally, Frederick Barbarossa, who had died in the river. And he's imprisoned and held in exchange for the payment of £100,000, which is an exorbitant sum, and it's literally a king's ransom that nearly bankrupts England and leaves his brother, Richard, a regent and his successor, in deep debt and in trouble. And the Crusades have ended up being 1 for 3, where the Christians have generally lost and the Muslims have had the upper hand.